resources to adapt and mitigate climate change. It is not fair that those that have been least responsible for climate change are the ones that are paying the first and most brutal price for the impacts of climate change. So with those words, let's make this march a historical march. Let's be peaceful. Let's send a clear message that we will be united and that a people united will never be defeated. A people united will never be defeated. A people united will never be defeated. Thank you.
Sisters and brothers, let me say, on behalf of the Labour movement in Ontario, a very solid welcome on behalf of 1 million workers to the environmentalists in the Labour movement, public sector workers and private sector workers and our community partners. Our messages today are very clear. We want to say to Stephen Harper how disgraceful it is that the First Nations peoples in this country of ours are living in abject poverty, and 100 communities are living without drinking water on a daily basis. Instead of spending $1 billion on security, we could have gone and built water treatment plants right across this province, such that our native children can actually live in health and have a decent standard of living. And instead, we're faced with water cannons, we're faced with sonic cannons, we're faced with rubber bullets and plastic bullets. 19,000 security forces, special armed forces from the Canadian Armed Forces. Sisters and brothers, our city is under siege. Why? Because the citizens of our nation, the citizens of our communities want to speak with one voice to the world leaders and say, hold on here a second, my friends. It wasn't the workers of the world or the workers of Canada that caused this financial crisis. We don't want to see a transferring of wealth from the public sector into the hands of the financial private sector. What we want to see is a transfer tax on all of those financial transactions. Let the corporate sector, let the financial sector pay for the economic crisis that they have created. We do not want to see a repeat of the Martin era in the 1990s. We want to say to Cameron from the UK, you can keep the Paul Martin austerity program of the 1990s. We're not going back to a time when our healthcare system was getting privatized, when unemployment insurance was slashed and only 30% of Canadian workers can access that program, even though every single one of us have to pay into it. We're not going to a point where the young children exiting our universities are doing so with a massive debt load on their shoulders. That's a program we don't want anymore, my friends. And finally, we want to say about globalization that Valley Inco, you've got the fate of the world in your hands. We don't want to see corporations coming into this nation of ours, taking the natural resources out of the ground and kicking the workers to the side of the streets for one solid year in Sudbury. Friends in the labour movement, friends in the environmental movement, the fight of the steel workers in Sudbury and in Port Colborne and in Boise's Bay is every one of our fights. For God's sake, let's come together. Let's unite the labour movement, the environmental movement, community activists. Let's speak with one solid voice and say that a new world can be dreamed of. We can have a different way of treating the citizens of the world. My friends, let's stay united together with the environmental community and the labour movement and the women's movement, and by God, we can move mountains. Thank you very much, sisters and brothers.
And I am just an ordinary student. I have $50,000 in student loans, and I am just an ordinary student. I am just an ordinary racialized woman, and by the time I have paid the interest on my student loans, I will have paid twice as much for the same education as someone who could pay in full up front. I am just an ordinary student who knows that education is the key to building a more just and equitable world. Education, when fully accessible become more of an economic destabilizer than an equalizer, as student debt in this country has surpassed $13 billion. And for those students who can't access it at all, the cost of education has simply become an opportunity neutralizer. Is this the kind of world we want to live in?
No!
Where only the rich deserve to learn? I'm just an ordinary student who's left to wonder where education fits within a system that values only commodities that can be bought or sold in a marketplace. Where does education fit within a system that relies on a pool of unskilled workers who can be forced to work for low wages with no rights? What is the point of programs like Caribbean Studies and Women's Studies in an economic system that doesn't give a crap about people or their human rights? The answer is clear, because right here in Ontario, they've made cuts to cultural studies at McMaster University. They've made cuts to women's studies at Guelph. They've made cuts to Caribbean studies at Ryerson. They've made cuts to the theatre school at Ryerson. They've made cuts to disability studies at UT, and everywhere. The fine arts are chronically underfunded. As our public institutions become private schools of business, students are losing the tools that we need to analyze and criticize